Never go to the ranch, Evelyn. Promise me." Those words, spoken with a calmness that felt like a warning, were one of the few requests my husband Richard ever made during our 27 years of marriage. I honored it, even when curiosity scratched quietly at the edges of my patience. He would mention Montana sometimes, never more than a sentence, never without that distant look that told me to stop asking. But now my husband Richard was gone, taken by a heart attack that no one, not even me, had seen coming. After 27 years of marriage, I had become a widow at 63 with a bitter daughter and a hollow space in my chest where certainty used to live. Mrs. Hartman, the voice of Richard's attorney, Mr. Lowell, pulled me back from that silence. He slid a small box across his desk, a brass key inside, and a folded note in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. It said only one thing: go to the ranch. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The first sound that morning was the zipper of a black dress. The mirror gave me a face I recognized but did not claim, the kind of face that appears when a house forgets laughter. I pinned my hair, chose simple earrings, and sat on the edge of the bed until the sunlight moved across the carpet and told me it was time. Outside, the air held that raw stillness that follows casseroles and condolences. My neighbor waved from her porch with both hands and a mouth shaped into sympathy. I lifted mine in return and pretended it mattered. The chapel smelled like lilies and floor polish. Folding chairs complained every time someone shifted. I stood near the front and let a river of hands pass over mine. He was a good man, they said. He worked hard, they said. He adored you, they said. I nodded as if they were telling me something I had not counted on every day for 27 years. Behind me, a slideshow cycled through images of us on beaches and porches and holidays. None of those pictures showed Montana. None of them showed a ranch. His absence did something strange to the room. It felt crowded and empty at the same time. After the service, Mr. Lowell waited by the double doors with a patience that made me nervous. His suit fit the way suits do on men who never run. He asked if I could stop by his office in the morning. His voice had the softness people use when they do not want to startle a wounded animal. I said yes because saying no would require a reason, and I had none I could pronounce. The rest of the day moved like a procession that never quite reached the street. I cut a piece of lemon pound cake and watched it sweat on the plate. I put it in the refrigerator. I took it out again. At dusk, I returned to our bedroom and placed my dress on the chair by the window. The chair looked surprised to be holding something that was not him. Morning came like a polite knock. Mr. Lowell worked out of a narrow brick building with a flag in front and a bell that announced old habits. The wood-paneled walls smelled like polish and winter. He offered coffee. I said no and then took it anyway because my hands needed a purpose. He cleared his throat and said Richard left something for me. He chose his words as if they could cut. Then he slid a small velvet pouch across the desk. Inside lay a brass key, the weight of a bird in the palm. My name was engraved on the bow. Beneath the pouch, a flat envelope appeared with my handwriting on the front. He said Richard had prepared everything to be as simple as possible. He said I would understand when I saw it. I traced the letters of my name on the key and felt the room tilt. The envelope held a single card and a copy of a deed printed on that crisp paper lawyers like. The card carried only 5 words written in his precise hand. Go to the ranch, Evelyn. The deed carried something heavier. It listed a parcel called the Ridgewood Ranch located in Montana. It listed a transfer of title that had taken place 3 years earlier. It listed my name as the owner. My breath shortened, and I decided to live in my throat. I looked up to ask a question and found that my voice had turned into a string someone had tied too tightly around a package. Mr. Lowell waited. He did not fill the silence with guesses. He knew that silence can be the first page of comprehension. When I could speak, I asked how long he had known. He answered in exact measures. He had been instructed to keep the existence of the property confidential unless Richard passed away or gave permission to lift the veil. He used that phrase, the veil, and it bothered me more than it should have. He added that all taxes were prepaid and that a caretaker had been appointed under a separate agreement. He said I did not need to decide anything today. He said grief and decisions do not share a table. I nodded and looked back down at the deed as if it might confess a motive if I stared hard enough. My mind went to our kitchen table, where we had paid bills and planned grocery lists, and pretended we were simple. I remembered the way he would change the subject whenever the word Montana floated into a conversation. An old project, he would say. Nothing for you there, he would say. It felt protective then. Standing in that office, it felt like a closed door at the end of a hallway I had lived in without seeing it. A memory rose that I had not invited. Early in our marriage, I had asked about his childhood. He outlined a small town and then erased it with a smile. "Let us talk about it now," he had said. I let him. I called that choice love. I held the key again. Old brass warms to the touch if your hand stays long enough. It changed from cold to alive in less than a minute. I whispered something without meaning to, but he never let me go there while he was alive. Mr. Lowell pretended not to hear. He gathered the empty envelope and placed it neatly in a side drawer. He told me he could arrange travel or introduce me to an associate who handled cross-state matters. He told me the caretaker was a man named Tom Ellis. He told me there were additional documents sealed until I physically set foot on the property. The way he said it physically made me notice my own body for the first time that day. My shoulders felt like a coat someone had forgotten to take off. I left the office with the key in my coat pocket and the deed pressed flat against my ribs. Outside, a wind had risen and made flags point to places I did not know. Cars moved along the street with the indifferent purpose of commerce. A young couple laughed into their phones. Somewhere in the building behind me, somebody closed a drawer and turned a lock. I walked to the car because the body loves routines when the mind is a house without furniture. Inside the quiet of the car, I set the deed on the passenger seat and watched the sunlight touch the seal. The seal was clean and official. It made my marriage feel like a room inside a larger house I had never entered. On the way home, everything I passed became evidence. The grocery store where he had once bought me a red apple that tasted better than some vacations. The post office where he had stood in line on Christmas Eve and cursed under his breath without ever saying a bad word. The park bench where he had told me that ordinary was a miracle and that the past was just a draft. I turned into our street more slowly than usual and parked half a space off because measuring felt ridiculous. The house greeted me with the same silence it had offered all week. I unlocked the door and stepped into a life that had become too well-behaved. I filled a glass with water and did not drink it. I took out the deed and spread it on the kitchen table next to a ring of coffee from a morning that had not known about this morning. The more I looked at the words, the less they seemed like language, and the more they seemed like a design. Parcel identification, legal description, mineral rights. The narrow language of possession hid something large. Why had he bought it back? Why had he buried it? Why leave it to me in a way that turned a promise into a test? I thought of Grace, my daughter, with her quick mind and quicker temper. I thought of telling her and then did not. Some news must be carried until it becomes a shape you can hand to another without cutting them. By afternoon, I had drifted through 4 rooms and 6 memories. I opened his closet and touched the cuff of a navy jacket. It smelled like cedar and a conference room. My fingers found the tight slide of a ticket stub deep in the pocket. A flight to Billings dated a winter 3 winters ago. I stood perfectly still and tried to hear the sound of that day. Maybe he had taken a late plane and returned before breakfast. Maybe he had told me he was consulting on a project, and I had said that sounded interesting and passed the salt. My heart thudded with a rhythm that reminded me of the first time we danced in a rented hall with bad speakers and good wine. This was how the body keeps time. It remembers even when the mind files everything under later. The doorbell rang and I did not jump. That surprised me. It was the caterer collecting trays and an envelope of receipts I did not open. We exchanged sentences that looked like politeness and felt like smoke. After she left, I walked back to the table and picked up the key. The edges had softened with the years. It felt made for a lock that expected it. I imagined the shape of the lock and the door that framed it, and the room that followed the door. I imagined a porch and a field and a line of fence that cut the horizon into equal parts. I imagined horses because the key made me think of fields, and fields made me think of time, and time made me think of the girl I had been with paint under her nails before I chose a steadier life. The day leaned into evening. The house changed temperature the way houses do when the sun goes looking for someone else to warm. Somewhere in the neighborhood a dog barked and then decided the world could continue without its opinion. I put the deed back into its envelope and slid both into the inside pocket of my coat. I practiced the motion twice so I would not fumble when it mattered. Then I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall and let the question arrive without interference. Do I honor the last instruction of a man I loved, Or do I honor the part of me he tried to protect by keeping it small? I walked to the bedroom and pulled the carry-on from the closet. It made the small sound of a thing that knows its purpose. I placed it open on the bed and stared at its emptiness until it looked like a beginning. 2 sweaters went in. 1 pair of jeans. Boots because Montana is a word that makes the feet practical. A scarf my mother knitted long ago that still carries a memory of her house. I returned to the kitchen and wrote a note for Grace that said I would be unavailable for a few days, and that I loved her and that everything was fine. I did not add the part where fine is a bridge you cross to get to true. Outside, the streetlights blinked into wakefulness. The limousine from the day before had left a faint indentation in the curb where tires had waited while mourners chose words. I locked the front door and listened to the click. It sounded final and kind. I placed the key in my pocket and closed my hand around it. The brass warmed again, as if it remembered the last palm. In my mind, I pictured a metal gate and a sign with a name I had never said out loud. The Ridgewood Ranch. The syllables felt like stepping stones over a river I had ignored. I slid into the driver's seat and adjusted the mirrors. The engine turned over with the steady confidence of machines that do not care who owns them. The door closed and made a sound the body remembers. A hinge, a seal, a small decision in a world of larger ones. I set the navigation to a town whose name meant nothing to me yet. The screen traced a line across states like a sentence across a page. The night pressed close to the windows. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and counted 5 breaths the way my therapist once taught me long ago, when breathing seemed optional. Then I lifted my head and placed both hands where they belonged. If love were a promise, then truth would be the journey. I pulled away from the curb and let the street carry me toward the interstate. The ranch waited north with its locked door and its waiting rooms and its explanations. The key pressed gently into my palm, as if to say that understanding is not a destination. It is a threshold you decide to cross. Every mile north felt like driving into a question I was not ready to answer. The highway unspooled beneath the tires in a clean gray ribbon. Wind pressed against the car as if the sky had hands. The navigation voice gave calm instructions that did not care about marriage or memory. I kept one eye on the thin blue route and one on the horizon where winter stood waiting. Billboards flashed past with names of towns I had never needed. The radio murmured, and I let it. The map on the screen told me how to move my body. The ache in my chest reminded me why. On the first long stretch of open road, I lowered the window an inch. Cold air slid in and cleared the last of the funeral scent that had clung to my coat. The engine hummed with the steady faithfulness of things that do their job. I watched the line between lanes go tick, 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 and tried to match my breathing to it. Every mile gathered me towards something that had lived for years at the edge of our conversations, a quiet no that shaped our yes. I crossed into the next state and stopped at a rest area with a row of clean sinks and a machine that sold coffee that tasted like apology. A woman with a little dog in a sweater smiled and asked if I was heading far. I said farther than I have ever allowed. That sounded dramatic, and she laughed lightly and told me to drive safely. The dog snored against her arm. I thanked her and returned to the car and the road and the old questions that had learned to wait. The first years of our marriage were a stack of good days. We filled a small apartment with borrowed furniture and a plant that refused to die. When people asked where we were from, he said Minnesota with a certainty that made the question close. The only time a different answer tried to enter the room was the night a friend showed us photos from Glacier. He said, "Look at this light. You have to see it with your own eyes." Richard smiled and handed back the phone and asked about the restaurant we had all been wanting to try. Later, I asked him what he remembered about Montana. He kissed my forehead and said, "I remember that I prefer the present." I told myself that this was wisdom. I did not notice that it was a wall. Years later, our neighbor bought a horse for his daughter and invited us to the county show. We leaned on the fence and watched muscle turn into motion. The girl rode with a focus that made her older than her age. I glanced at Richard to share the quiet of it and found him staring at the farthest field. His face had that tight gentleness he wore when he was listening to pain in another room. I touched his sleeve and asked if he wanted to stay for the next event. He shook himself back into where we were and said he was hungry and we should get pie. We got pie. He asked the waitress for extra napkins and left a tip that made her eyes round. When we walked out, he looked lighter. He whistled a tune I did not know. We drove home and put the day where it would not bother anyone. I tried again a few summers after that when a colleague mentioned hiking near Bozeman. She said the air there feels like glass. We were washing dishes, and I said maybe we should take a trip west. He stacked the plates carefully and said he had deadlines, and could we wait until winter went somewhere else? Then winter came, and the trip went quiet. At some point, I stopped hearing my own curiosity. If you cover a clock long enough, the ticking becomes part of the house. Afternoon tilted light into gold, and I kept moving. The road lifted into long, shallow climbs, then flattened again. Trucks passed with that muscular wind that yanks at a small car. I called the number Mr. Lowell had written on a card. He answered on the second ring. His voice traveled across the line with its well-pressed calm. I told him I was on my way. I asked a question I had not planned to ask. When Richard bought the land, was his name on the first contract? There was a pause, small but deliberate. Then he said the acquisition was made through a holding entity. He spelled a name that sounded familiar and not. I asked what it meant. He said it was a legal instrument and that everything had been placed in my name cleanly. He said I would find additional context at the property. He said the caretaker could help with logistics and that he had been notified of my arrival. He did not add a single word he did not mean to add. I hung up, and the car felt smaller. A memory surfaced and surprised me. Years ago, I had asked Richard for his mother's maiden name for a form. He had answered Whitman and then kissed my knuckles and made a joke about poetry. The name Mr. Lowell had spelled did not match Whitman. It matched a nickname I once heard in an old birthday card that had arrived without a return address. To R. Warren, the card had said, a name that fit him and did not. I realized my husband had been leaving a trail like a man crossing snow who wants the wind to erase his prints. The purchase had not been under Richard Hartman. It had been under something that allowed him to be close without being seen. He had moved an entire property through the quiet grammar of paperwork and placed it in my name as if tucking a note into my pocket for later. I drove until the sky went pewter, and the outline of mountains began to write themselves against it. The road narrowed and gave me fewer lanes and more honesty. I stopped for gas in a town with one main street, and a laundromat with a handwritten sign that promised warmth. The clerk behind the counter had a face that had learned winter early. He asked if I was passing through. I said I was meeting someone, he said. Then you must be lucky. The wind off the ridge can be unkind. He rang up a bag of trail mix and pointed me toward a turn I would have missed. He did it in that careful way small towns have when they decide to give a stranger the correct piece of information. Back in the car, my phone lit up with Grace. Her name filled the screen with the soft blue that always makes me feel kinder than I am. I answered and tried to make my voice an easy place to sit. She asked where I was. I told her I was on the way to Montana. She went quiet and then exhaled. Mom, you should not go there alone. The sentence came out flat with worry and a little anger. I drove another quarter-mile before answering. I have been alone since the day your father started keeping secrets. The truth of that sentence vibrated through the steering wheel. She said, I do not like this. I said, I do not like it either. She asked what I expected to find. I said, a door that knows this key. She said, call me when you stop for the night. I promised. We sat in the sound of our breath for a few seconds, then said the small words that keep people safe. Love you. Take care. Call me. Then the line went clean, and I looked back to the road that was taking me where I said I would go. Snow began as a suggestion, a few shy flakes that surprised the windshield and disappeared. Then it gathered into something you could hear. The wipers found their rhythm. The mountains came closer and turned the sky into a low ceiling. I followed the navigation to a county route that pretended to be a road only when it felt like it. Fences appeared in the fields with the authority of lines that someone had believed in for a long time. Cattle stood like punctuation marks in the white grammar of the pasture. A hawk cut a piece of sky and kept it. Dusk fell the way a curtain falls when the stage manager is sober. The fog came with it. It rose from the ground and wrapped the lower fences and leaned against the trunks of trees. The world narrowed to the pair of beams my car threw forward. Every turn became a question, and every answer was, I will know in a moment. I slowed and felt my shoulders climb toward my ears and told them to come back down. Somewhere, a creek moved under ice with that private sound water makes when it is working and no one is watching. The last coordinates brought me to a gravel lane that my tires entered like a room. The fog thickened and made the world polite. I crept forward and let the car find the center by instinct. The lane curved and then straightened. And then there it was, black iron rising from stone posts, an arch with a name in letters that had known weather, Ridgewood. The curves of the word carried a history I could not read yet. It stood there like a gate to a different grammar. On either side, the land flowed away into a white that held its breath. I put the car in park and listened to the tick of cooling metal. Snow touched the windshield in softer rhythms. For a moment, I did not move. I let my heart slow until it matched the pace of falling flakes. Then I opened the door. Cold air filled the car and took ownership of my lungs. The wind slipped under my collar and reminded me that some places greet you with clarity instead of comfort. I stepped out, and the gravel received me with that careful crunch that makes you feel both welcome and warned. The gate was taller than I had imagined. Up close, I could see flecks of rust where the paint had been honest. A small plate near the hinge held a number. A keypad waited like a question that I had expected. I reached into my coat and closed my hand around the brass key. The metal had the same quiet heat it had taken from me before. I rested my palm on the iron bar and felt its chill and solidity and the old logic of barriers. Fog moved through the loops of the letters, as if language could breathe. Somewhere beyond the gate, something knocked once. Maybe a loose shutter. Maybe a branch. Maybe my own heart found the door it had been promised. I pressed the call button on the post because that is what you do when a threshold asks who you are. The speaker clicked and held a space. I said my name out loud into the mist. I said I am Evelyn Hartman, and I have come to the place my husband told me never to see. My breath made a small cloud that tried to stay and then could not. In the little pause that followed, I heard the wind lift and set something down with care. The keypad glowed awake and waited for a code I did not know. I slid the key into my pocket again and took a single step back to see the gate as a whole. It looked less like a barrier and more like a statement. Behind it lay a life that had been edited out of mine. I stood there in the open cold with my hand on my coat and felt the line between past and truth run under my feet. Then I lifted my chin and set my boot more firmly on the gravel and prepared to cross. It felt like walking into his mind, beautiful, precise, and full of locked doors. The gate released with a heavy click that rolled through the fog like a drumbeat. I eased the car forward, and the lane narrowed to an intimate path. Pines leaned in close and shook snow from their sleeves. The house appeared by degrees, first the roofline, then the tall windows, then the wraparound porch with its quiet stance. I parked near the steps and sat for one long breath to let my heart catch up with my arrival. The brass key warmed in my pocket as if it had been waiting for this moment more patiently than I had. I opened the car door, and the cold rushed in to claim my breath. Gravel accepted my weight with a courteous crunch. Up close, the house was not grand in the way that demands attention. It was grand in the way a good sentence is grand, every element placed so nothing shows off. The front door wore a coat of deep green, the kind that seems born from the forest rather than paint. I pressed the key into the lock. It turned with that small, steady resistance that tells you a mechanism has been cared for. The latch gave, and the door eased inward as if a hand from the other side had helped me. Inside, it smelled like beeswax and cedar, and a hint of lavender that did not come from a bottle. I stood on the threshold and let the space introduce itself. The entry opened to a high room with exposed beams and a stone hearth that could hold a winter without complaint. Light fell from long windows and spread across a polished floor. It caught on something that shimmered in a way that was not bright, only honest. I moved forward, and the room moved with me. Paintings lined the walls, not museum-famous, but chosen with care. Horses ran through them in different weather, each captured in that precise instant when power looks like air. A chestnut tossed its mane and became a river. A gray galloped into a storm and became the storm. A small bronze sculpture on the mantel showed a mare bending her head toward a foal, the curve between them so gentle it made my throat ache. I do not know how long I stood there before I recognized that every image carried a memory I had held alone. Richard had never claimed horses as his interest. He had claimed me. He had watched the way my eyes changed at a glimpse of muscle turning into motion. Then he built a room that would catch that change and give it back. I traced the frame of one canvas with my gaze, and the subject shifted from animal to time. Years earlier, we had wandered through a gallery on a rainy Saturday, and I had stopped at a painting of a black horse against a pewter sky. He had looked at me and then at the title card and then at me again in that way that says something just rearranged behind his face. I did not know he would carry that quiet rearrangement for this long. It felt like finding a letter tucked into a book I had not opened since my youth. The paper is old, but the ink is fresh. There was a table under the windows with a bowl of dried lavender set in the center. My fingertips brushed the purple heads and released a scent that lifted a decade from my shoulders. The fragrance settled in the air like a closed eye. I could see myself in another life, sleeves rolled, a brush in my hand, the steady patience of paint teaching me how to breathe. I had put that away when Grace arrived, then again when Richard began to work late, then again when the mortgage made our choices practical. He had watched me put it away without argument, and now here it was returning to greet me before I even asked. The kitchen waited to the left, bright and orderly, copper pots catching pale light, a long wooden table with 2 mugs on a tray as if someone had planned to offer hospitality to the future. A folded linen lay beside them, the soft kind you buy one at a time when money feels finite. The stove was clean, the sink was dry. I opened a drawer and found cutlery aligned as if a clock had arranged it. I closed it and felt the small satisfaction of a sound that belongs to home. Beyond the kitchen, a sunroom faced the pasture. Floor-to-ceiling panes framed a wash of white, and the faint shapes of fencing retreating into fog. The way the light filled that room felt like a promise. It asked for a chair and a book, and the words spoken later without guilt. A hallway led away from the great room like a sentence leading toward its true subject. On one wall hung photographs of landscapes that I had once pointed to in magazines. Sagebrush under a high sky. A river that looks like polished slate. Snow caught on barbed wire in a lace learned from winter. The choices were not random. They were mine and not mine. He had taken my private preferences and turned them into architecture. Art is placed at eye level. Hooks where a hand would naturally reach. A switch plate that matched the wood instead of interrupting it. I felt both seen and considered, which is a rarer feeling than love. I pushed open a door and found a room that silenced me. An easel stood near a north-facing window where the light was even and generous. Canvases leaned against the wall in a neat row, not blank because blank is a kind of accusation, but primed and ready like snow before footprints. Brushes rested in glass jars, their bristles fanned as if they had been combed. Paints in a narrow drawer waited in their own quiet order. Not the cheap student tubes you throw in a bag, but the heavy kind that hold more pigment than compromise. A small sink with a deep basin promised that the mess would never be punished. I did not realize I had sat until I felt the chair under me. He watched me paint once, and never let me stop again, not here. The words came without my permission. They did not feel like complaining. They felt like a ceremony. I touched one brush as if it were a hand. My fingers remembered the way to test a bristle against my thumbnail. The muscle memory arrived like a childhood friend who always knew where the snacks were. I let the brush go and moved to the cabinet near the window. Inside lay sketchbooks stacked with a patience that hurt. On the first page of the top book, a pencil waited under the strap. Beneath it, someone had copied a sentence from a book we had both loved when we were younger and too sure. "Begin where the light is kind." I stood there and said his name, and the room held it without echo. Across the hall, a library sat with its door a little open, as if a reader had stepped out only long enough to warm a cup. Shelves climbed to the ceiling. A ladder on a track waited for a hand that enjoys small risks. The spines showed years of listening. Poetry arranged near memoir, field guides to birds beside books of letters, reference volumes on ranch management placed next to modern architecture. He had curated not only beauty but usefulness. On the desk by the window, a laptop rested, closed, and a single fresh rose lay across the lid. The stem wore one short ribbon, nothing dramatic, just a mark of intention. I did not touch it. I was not ready for any device that might speak in his voice. I let the rose do the talking. It said patience. It said later will arrive on its own feet. A coat hung on a peg by the back door, a heavy barn coat like the ones worn by men who respect the weather even when they have paperwork. I slid my arm into one sleeve and felt a scrap of folded paper in the pocket. Not a letter, not a secret, only a list of hardware supplies and a phone number with no name. Proof that someone had been making choices here that required nails and plans. I hung the coat back up and faced the doorway. The hallway beckoned me to more doors, but I did not want to collect rooms like seashells. I wanted to let each speak in its time. I returned to the great room and sat on the edge of the hearth. The stone held the memory of many fires. My eyes traveled over the paintings again and found small signatures in the corners, tiny initials placed with care. He had chosen artists who cared about the moments between. Hooves just before they touch ground, ears turning toward something outside the frame, breath made visible by cold. The collection felt like a conversation about movement and rest. I thought of the years we sat at our kitchen table discussing groceries while this house was taking shape. I thought of the mornings he had left before sunrise, coffee in a travel mug, saying he would be late and to start dinner without him. I believed then that he was building stability. I know now he was building a sanctuary. The difference feels like an apology I accept. In the corner near the window, a music player waited with a stack of records in sleeves that showed a human hand. Piano mostly, some cello, a little old jazz that made my pulse remember dancing. I set a record gently on the turntable and lowered the arm. The first notes walked into the room without introducing themselves. They settled around the furniture and took off their coats. I stood in the middle of the floor and let the sound teach me where to put my feet. The lavender in the bowl released more fragrance as if to join the music. I closed my eyes and saw our small apartment from decades ago, the one with the crooked bookshelf and the sink that groaned when you asked too much of it. I saw the day Richard came home early and found me at the kitchen table with a canvas propped against a stack of cookbooks. The way he leaned in the doorway and watched without interrupting told me something that still matters. He knew the difference between attention and interference. He kept that difference, and now he had built me a room made of it. I moved to the window and pressed my palm to the cool glass. The fog had thinned a little, and the field beyond resolved into lines and corners. A fence traced the edge of the pasture like a sentence that was still being written. Far off, a stand of trees grouped as if they trusted one another. Everything about the view felt deliberate without feeling staged. I exhaled, and the glass clouded and cleared. Then the sound arrived, distant at first, growing into focus. Tires on gravel, the rhythm of arrival that does not belong to you. I turned down the music until the room held its breath. The sound came closer, proceeding along the lane with the confidence of men accustomed to driving places that are not theirs. A black shape coalesced through the thinning fog. It rolled to a stop near the porch and idled there, the engine making that low, steady hum of something that expects to be obeyed. I stood very still and listened to my pulse settle into a slower beat. The house held the scent of lavender and wood polish and the soft metallic hint of snow. Paintings watched quietly from the walls. Somewhere, a clock ticked in a tone that approved of patience. I placed the key on the mantel beside the bronze mare and foal, then smoothed my hair with both hands as if the air itself were a mirror. The gravel had stopped speaking. The door waited. Whatever this place was meant to be for me, it was also something to them. The difference would define the next hour. I took one step toward the entry, and another, ready to greet what wanted to enter, even if it arrived with the wrong idea of welcome. 3 men stepped out of the SUV, wearing my husband's face and none of his kindness. They stood in a triangle at the bottom of the porch steps with their hands tucked into expensive coats, while the engine idled like a low growl behind them. Fog lifted in soft ropes from the gravel, and the thin winter light made their features look carved. Alan had the lawyer's posture that turns a doorway into a lectern. Peter carried his body as if rooms knew to part when he entered. Carl stood slightly behind the other 2 and watched everything with a steady blankness. For a long breath, we measured one another without words. Then I opened the door fully and let the house air touch the cold. I did not invite them in. The threshold felt like a line I did not intend to surrender. Lavender rose from the bowl on the entry table and mixed with the outside chill. The paintings on the walls seemed to hold their breath. I kept my hands at my sides and let my voice be as plain as a chair. "Can I help you?" Alan's smile was the kind you practice in front of a mirror until it can stand by itself. He said my name as if trying it on. He said they were Richard's brothers and they had come to discuss the property. The word property lay over everything like a towel on a birdcage. I told them we could speak on the porch. Alan reached into his coat and produced a heavy envelope. White, thick, edges square as intended. Peter set one foot on the bottom step as if he were already inside and only being polite about the order of events. Carl remained still and let his eyes touch the interior of the house without moving his head. The cold light sharpened the planes of their faces, and I saw pieces of Richard worn like borrowed jewelry that did not suit them. I stepped out and pulled the door until it rested against my hip. My fingers stayed on the knob. The brass felt like a small sundae. Alan handed me the envelope. It had that crisp legal smell of toner and someone else's schedule. He said they had filed an emergency petition in the county court concerning the transaction by which this ranch was acquired. He said there were serious concerns about capacity at the time of purchase. He spoke the word capacity with a gentleness that pretends to be mercy. I asked what they were claiming. He said the court would see reason. He told me I should avoid making decisions that might complicate the matter. He said it would be best if we all worked together until clarity could be achieved. I slid the papers free and scanned the first page. Names. Case number. The paragraph that always begins with the same tired words. Then the assertion that Richard was not of sound mind at the time of acquisition, supported by hearsay and a thin stack of exhibits I did not read fully. I kept my face quiet. The fog curled up and over the porch rail and put its cool fingers on my ankles. Somewhere behind them, a bird made a single sound that might have been a complaint. I lifted my eyes from the page and found Alan watching me for a reaction he could use. "This house is mine." I said it calmly, as if I were arranging cutlery on a table. "The deed is in my name. Taxes have been paid. A caretaker is under contract. If you have a claim, file it, and we will let the court write its sentence. Until then, you are guests at my door." Peter looked past me again, as if a single glance could catalog value. He told me they had flown in to resolve this with dignity. He told me no one was here to make a scene. He told me a woman alone on an isolated property could use the help of family. The word family rolled in his mouth like a coin between teeth. I kept hold of the knob and felt my pulse steady against the metal. I said I had not been alone since I learned how to keep company with my own breath. I said I would not accept their help. Alan began another sentence about the proper handling of assets and the risk of waste. I let him finish. Then I said, "So will I, but not your version of it." The sentence landed between us and lay there like a clean line. For a moment, none of them spoke. The engine idled behind them, and the fog continued to lift itself into the trees. Carl finally let his eyes meet mine. His gaze did not challenge. It assessed. He asked almost gently whether I had someone advising me. I heard the trap wrapped in kindness. I answered that I had all the advice I needed for today. He nodded once, then let his attention slide back to the ground near my boots, as if the gravel might confess something. Alan adjusted his cuffs and shifted to a different tactic. He said there had been irregularities in the paperwork, an entity used to mask the true purchaser, and transfers designed to avoid ordinary review. He said these were not the choices of a man thinking clearly. He spoke as if every misdirection in the file had to be the product of confusion, not strategy. The name he used for the holding company matched the one Mr. Lowell had spelled over the phone. Hearing it from this mouth made it sound like a threat rather than a precaution. I told him that complexity is not always a symptom. Sometimes it is a plan. Peter leaned his weight a little harder into the step. "We all understand the value of what lies under these hills," he said. "The community does, the county does, and so do we." He looked at my face to see if the word value would open any doors. I did not move. He continued, saying that this could end amicably if I agreed to stand down while the court considered their petition. He suggested a temporary agreement, allowing them access to the property for appraisal and oversight. He offered to put something in writing immediately, then gestured at Alan, who had another envelope ready like a magician who only knows one trick. I looked at the papers in my hand again and saw what I needed to see. The language was polished in a way that hides its own edges. The petition asked for more than time. It asked for possession disguised as supervision. It asked for keys I had not yet used on doors I had not yet opened. I closed the envelope and handed it back. "No." Peter's eyebrows rose as if I had interrupted the natural order. Alan's mouth tightened just enough to show habit. Carl did not react at all. Alan tried a softer tone. He said grief clouds judgment. He said a pause protects everyone. He said they understood how hard this must be. I let his words stack up like boxes I did not order. Then I set them aside with one sentence. "Richard chose this. His choices deserve the courtesy of being read before they are erased." The porch boards held my weight, and the house did too. For a moment, I felt the architecture steady me from the ground up. The door at my hip felt like a partner, not an exit. Peter's face cooled. He said that I was making this adversarial. He said that legal fees are expensive and that courts can be slow. He said that goodwill has a shelf life. He let the last phrase hang in the air. I thought of shelves and the things people put on them when they are done using them. I did not answer his warning. I looked beyond them, past the SUV, to where the lane curved and the pines stood with a patience they had learned from weather. Somewhere out there was the long field I had seen from the sunroom. Somewhere out there the ranch kept its own counsel. I found that I could keep mine. Alan collected himself and said he would be in touch with a court date. He reminded me that service would be perfected tomorrow. He said a deputy might come by. He said I should not be alarmed. He said it in a way that knows what happens when people with badges approach a house where a woman stands alone. I nodded once to show that I had heard the information and would decide for myself how to feel about it. Peter placed a business card on the top step as if leaving a gift no one wanted. Carl took one last long look past my shoulder. The look had weight. It tried to measure inventory and resolve. It learned nothing useful. The three of them turned as one and walked back to the SUV. Doors opened and closed with efficient thuds. The engine deepened, and the vehicle reversed down the lane. For a moment, the fog swallowed the taillights, and then the trees did. The porch felt larger without them. I stayed where I was until the quiet became convincing. My hand left the knob, and a small print of warmth stayed behind on the brass. I stepped back into the house and closed the door. The latch caught with a sound like a period. The lavender bowl waited on the table and gave up a little more fragrance as if to welcome me home. The room reclaimed its breath. I moved through the entry and returned to the great room, where the light from the tall windows pooled on the floor in calm shapes. On the library desk, the laptop sat where I had left it, closed, a single rose across its lid. I switched on the small lamp beside it. The shade cast a soft circle that made the room feel closer without making it small. In the reflection on the dark screen, I saw my face, and beyond it, the quiet paintings. Horses, running into storms that did not break them. I felt the weight of the papers that were no longer in my hand. I thought of the words they carried, and the words that might wait inside the device in front of me. I stood very still and listened to the household hold its silence like a promise. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard the faintest roll of tires over gravel again, only the echo of departure traveling back as sound. The lamplight rested in my eyes, and the laptop, patient as a sealed letter, waited to be opened. His face appeared healthy, smiling, as if death had not been enough to keep him from explaining. The screen brightened the library like a small theater. The lamp cast its steady circle. The rose lay where he had left it, a soft witness. I pulled the second chair closer and did not sit in it. An empty chair has a way of telling the truth without speaking. I entered the only password a person like us could have guessed, and the machine accepted me without argument. A file pulsed on the desktop. I clicked before my courage decided to wait. "Hello, Eve." His voice reached across the room with that measured warmth that used to smooth the corners of our evenings. "If you are watching this, I am gone." I asked the screen what kind of gone. It did not answer. I leaned in and touched my fingertips to the wood of the desk to remind myself I was still in a house with walls and beams and a roof that kept the weather where weather belongs. He sat in this very room when he recorded it. I could see a sliver of books behind his shoulder and the edge of the window where the pasture begins to pull the eye. He had shaved close. He wore the blue sweater I always stole when I had a cold. His eyes held that brightness people get when they have decided to tell the whole truth at last. He did not begin with apologies. He began with gratitude. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for believing in small days. Thank you for teaching me to read the same poem twice. It took 3 sentences for my throat to burn." He lifted a piece of paper as if to consult it and then set it aside without looking. He said he had been given news 3 winters ago that turned time into something with teeth. He used the word inherited and the word heart, and I understood more than I wanted to. He described the way the doctor had drawn a diagram on a blank page and said, "This will ask more of you than you think you have." He said he looked at the diagram and thought of me. He thought of how to make a room in which I would not be alone. He thought of light. He thought of a place that could hold me gently when he could not. I felt the chair under me only when I shifted, and it complained softly. The screen made his skin look warmer than it ever did in winter. He spoke slowly, not to delay, but to be careful with the shape of each word. He said he chose not to tell me because he did not want the last stretch of our days to become an appointment. He did not want me to carry a countdown. He did not want every new ache to look like a prophecy. He wanted ordinary and knew that ordinary would be impossible if I had the same information he had. He was wrong about what I could carry, and he was right about what would have broken me. I pressed my fingers to my lips and heard myself whisper through them, "You liar and you lover." He smiled as if he had heard me. He said he had begun searching for land in the region where his earliest ancestors had made him. He said he drove roads he had not let me see. He said he found Ridgewood, and it was as ruined as memory and as promising as a good seed. He said he used a name that would not ring any bells at a bank or a county office. He said he organized the purchase in a way that would keep the wrong eyes from looking where they had no right to look. He said none of that was an insult to me. It was protection for me. He did not ask me to forgive him. He asked me to stand in the light he had built when I was ready. He shifted in the chair, and the camera found his hands for a moment. He had a small blue vein on the back of his right hand that always made me think of the first map a child draws. It looked the same. He said he had hired a caretaker with good hands and a past that deserved a second telling. He said I would like Tom Ellis. He said Tom would keep the fences honest and the pipes warm and the equipment ready for the weather that shows up when it wants to. He said accounts were established and taxes were paid, and that I did not have to become a person who understands everything about acreage to belong here. He said belonging happens before understanding, and that understanding follows if you treat it kindly. He paused, as if listening for a sound in the house, then he laughed quietly and shook his head. "You always painted light, Eve. I built you a house made of it." The sentence went through me like a winter sun finding a clean window. I thought of the studio down the hall with its calm jars and ready canvas. I thought of the way the north windows welcomed the day without scolding it. He had watched my life with more attention than I had given myself, and then he made a place where that attention could keep working after he could not. He spoke of practical things without pretending they were more important than they were. The code for the gate is in the top drawer of the desk in the library. He gestured toward where I was sitting, and a chill climbed my arms. Keys for the outbuildings are in a small wooden box on the kitchen shelf behind the tea jars. Do not worry about the generator. It kicks on when it should. The old road to the west pasture is passable if you take it slowly. Hire help before spring if you plan to plant anything. The fence line by the creek likes to lie about its stability. These details from a man who would never again watch a storm roll over this roof felt like stitches repairing a tear. Every instruction said, "I am not here, but I will not abandon you." He did not mention his brothers by name. He did not need to. He said some people will arrive with certainty and urgency. He said certainty and urgency dressed as concern are still certainty and urgency. He said I would know what to do when they stood where he was sitting now and tried to make the past into a weapon. He told me not to shout. He told me to keep my voice even. He told me to trust the records he left and to remember that my calm was a door they could not open. I looked at the screen and thought of the porch and the fog and the way Peter had set his foot on the step as if assuming it would hold him. He leaned closer, and the camera gave me his eyes in full. He said he wanted to talk about fear. He said secrets are not always about shame. Sometimes they are about shelter. He said he had been afraid to watch me try to be brave for both of us at once. He said he had wanted to let me be only myself for as long as possible. He said he knew I would be angry, and that he would accept that anger if acceptance were still possible. He said he was asking me for an impossible thing. He was asking me to hold two truths in the same hand. He kept this from me. He did it with love. I did not realize tears had been on my face until one reached my lip. Salt reminded me that I was a person and not a screen. I wiped my cheek with the heel of my hand and laughed once without humor. The empty chair beside me held its place. I placed my palm on the seat for a second as if to share the weight of this with something that could take it. Everything in the room kept quiet company, and for that I was grateful. He stood for a moment, and the frame filled with his sweater, and then the room behind him. He walked to the window and lifted the curtain. Light touched his face and made him look younger, the way people look when they are telling the truth about love. He said he had timed some of these messages to the seasons of this place. He said he hoped I would allow the land to teach me its language. He said winter looks like death when you do not know where to look. He said winter is a pause, not an ending. He said spring arrives here by the hour, not the day, and that the first green will make me feel like a person returning from a long illness. He said summer will try to trick me into thinking it lasts. He said fall will remind me that beauty requires surrender. He came back to the chair and picked up a small notebook. He flipped it open and closed it without reading. He said he would not speak long each time. He said grief is a muscle that cannot be overworked. He said we would take this in the right size. He smiled again, that smile that always made me think of front porches and warm bread. He looked past the camera for a second, as if someone else had entered the room, and then looked back at me like he had decided I was the only person in it who mattered. He said one more thing. I have set things in motion that will make this place safe even when you feel unsure. If you ever doubt that, walk into the room with the light from the north and put your hand on the tall window, and remember that I built this to outlast my fear. The video ended the way evenings do when you forget to notice that the light has moved to another wall. The screen went still on the slope of his shoulder and then fell to black. The library breathed in and breathed out. I stared at my own dim reflection in the dark glass of the lid. I could hear a very small sound in the house that might have been the settling of wood or the memory of his voice deciding to live somewhere else. I closed the laptop, and the lamp seemed brighter without the screen to compete with it. I sat for a while without naming the length of time. Somewhere outside, snow shifted in place and decided to keep falling. The empty chair remained empty and offered that emptiness as a kind of steady hand. I thought of a doctor with a diagram and a winter 3 years ago, and a man who counted not by months but by what could be built between them. I thought of how often I had asked small questions and how carefully he had answered the ones he could. I thought of the way secrets can bruise a marriage and the way love can heal it without removing the bruise. When I finally stood, my body told me how long I had stayed very still. I took the rose from the laptop and placed it in a glass of water on the desk. I switched off the lamp, and the room changed shape. The screen held a little afterglow, and then let it go. I walked to the window and pushed the curtain aside. The sky had begun to pale at its lowest edge. That color that is not blue yet. The first line of morning wrote itself above the pasture. The glow of the laptop in my mind softened until it felt like a memory, and then the real light rose to meet it. I stood there with my palm against the cold glass and watched darkness pick up its coat and leave the field. He had kept a truth from me. He had done it because he could not bear to make me carry his fear before I had to. People who keep secrets do not always hide facts. Sometimes they hide the sound of the thing they cannot change. I stayed at the window until the first bird told the day it was expected. Then I went to the hallway where the studio waited, and stood in the doorway, and let the pale morning step inside. They wanted dirt. They did not know it hid gold. The morning had the color of tin and the taste of old wind. I made coffee because the body believes in rituals even when the heart has stopped asking for them. The library lamp gave a tender circle of light, and the rose held its silence. I opened the curtains and let the day in. Then I called Mr. Lowell. He answered on the second ring with that careful steadiness that makes people trust paper. I told him about the envelope the brothers brought and the language pressed inside it. Emergency petition. Capacity. Supervision dressed as benevolence. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he spoke in sentences that fit inside a breath. Hold the property. Do not sign anything at the door. Keep a record of every conversation. We will engage local counsel by noon. He paused and added something that made me feel accompanied. You do not have to be loud to be clear. I placed the phone on speaker and spread the brothers' papers across the desk. The type looked confident but tired, the way a trick looks once you know how it is done. He asked me to read the caption at the top. I did. He made a note. He said their claim rested on the idea that Richard lacked capacity 3 years ago at the time of acquisition. He said we would address that with medical records and affidavits, and the clean chain of title already in my name. Then he said a sheriff deputy might arrive to complete service. He said I should treat the visit as a weather event I had already prepared for. A knock sounded in the hall, and I started before I recognized the rhythm as the house. Wood settles in winter. I breathed. Mr. Lowell asked a question. Where is the purchase binder? He meant the spine of evidence that keeps a deed standing upright. I had not seen a binder. I told him where I had looked. He suggested I try the lower drawer of the library desk and the kitchen shelf behind the tea jars. He sounded like a man who had already walked these rooms in his mind. The lower drawer resisted before it yielded. Inside sat a flat portfolio tied with twine and a folder marked surveys in a handwriting that was not my husband's but was familiar to him. My pulse slowed until I could turn the string without clumsy fingers. I laid the portfolio open and found maps bigger than the desk could hold in one piece. Thin lines made a language out of the land. Red marks swept across the western acres in arcs that reminded me of veins in a wrist. The color was not accidental. It was the shade of insistence. I told Mr. Lowell what I was seeing. He did not speak for a moment. Then he asked if there were dates or initials in the corner. I found both. 3 winters ago. Small initials from a firm that sounded like geology and law had a child. He exhaled in a way that let me know this mattered. He said Richard had commissioned a subsurface survey with independent verification. He said that meant the value of the property was not merely the surface and fences but what lay under the tired grass. He said we would not use the words the brothers were hoping to hear. We would use mineral rights and valuation, and a chain of custody for data. The kitchen shelf gave me a small wooden box behind the tea jars, exactly where the video had promised keys would live. Under the keys, a slim envelope waited like a shy fact. Inside, I found letters of intent from 2 companies with long names that pretended to be local. They offered lease terms with numbers that made my stomach feel like an elevator. At the bottom of each letter there was a sentence. Recipient declined. Thank you for your time. The dates lined up with the survey. He had known, and still he refused. I carried the folder back to the desk and laid the map out carefully. My hands did not shake. The red arcs looked like truth and also like bloodlines running beneath an old scar. I pictured the western pasture I had not yet walked. Yesterday, it had looked like winter pretending to be permanent. Brown grass and a fence that wanted to lie down. A field that says keep driving. The surface is sometimes an actor. Mr. Lowell said something I needed. This is leverage, not a confession. We reveal it on our terms. I asked what my terms should be. He said I should let him assemble a response and put a local attorney in front of the judge as soon as the clerk would allow. He said I should expect a friendly phone call, which does not mean friendship. He said people who smell value often arrive with a smile and a plan for your comfort. I folded the map gently and felt the red marks leave a faint chalk on my fingertips. I told him I wanted a plan that fit my voice. I did not want a scene or a headline. I wanted a sentence no one could argue away. He said the law is a set of sentences if you use it correctly. He said we would file a motion to dismiss the claim for lack of evidence and a request for sanctions if they persisted in bad faith. He said those words in his even tone, and they sounded like a porch you can stand on. The phone clicked, and another voice joined. He introduced Ms. Reyes, a local attorney with a weather in her voice. She asked me to tell her what happened at the porch yesterday, using only what could be written in a declaration. I did, and she took notes I could hear. She asked if any of the men stepped inside. I said no. She asked if they made any verbal threats. I said they did not use that word, but they tried to move things forward with urgency. She said urgency is not a court order. She said she would be at the clerk's office when it opened. The piano I had left on low in the great room sent a few soft notes down the hall. The house listened. I leaned back and let the sound brace me. I told them I was ready to stand still while they worked. Then I felt something sharper than resolve. It was the thin edge that shows up when a woman who has been polite long enough decides to use her full name. I whispered it first to see how it fit. If greed is a storm, let it rain on me first. I will still stand. The sentence tasted like iron and green things. I said it again out loud so they could hear that I meant it. Ms. Reyes hummed approval and said she would put the message into proper motion. Mr. Lowell said he would organize affidavits regarding Richard's health and capacity from the years in question. He said time does not have to be our enemy when we are the ones who keep records. We ended the call with those small words that tidy a plan, and then the house became only a house again. I looked at the empty chair beside mine. It was still empty, but it had become a partner. I thought of telling Grace and decided to wait until I could give her a shape that would not cut her hand. I gathered the papers and placed them in the portfolio and returned it to the drawer. Then I stood and went to the window. The western field lay under the same thin light as before. A hawk hung in the air as if it had been pinned there by an invisible thread. The fence line looked tired but stubborn. Under that bare grammar, something older ran, a vein, a seam, an inheritance that did not rely on last names. I put my palm against the glass, and it felt like the start of a vow. Footsteps sounded on the porch. Not the measured echo of men in a cluster, but the direct stride of a single person who belongs to the weather. When I opened the door, I found a man with gray in his beard and hands who worked for a living. He removed his hat with an ease that said please and thank you live side by side in his mouth. "Ma'am," he said. I am Tom Ellis. I manage the place. He did not look past me. He looked at me. The respect in that look steadied a breath I had not noticed had gone unsure. I stepped back and let him enter, because some thresholds are meant to admit help. He paused just inside to remove his boots. He asked if I was well. I said yes in the way people do when the answer is a piece of a longer story. I told him about the men and the petition, and the map. His eyes sharpened at the word survey and then softened at the word refusal. He nodded slowly and said, "Your husband had a spine that did not require an audience." He asked if I wanted to see the outbuildings this afternoon and check on a few things that need attention in cold weather. I told him I would. Then I asked a question that had been waiting. "When did you meet him?" He said 3 years ago on a morning when the sky made a person believe in repair. He said Richard had offered him work and an honest wage and did not ask for a history that would make the offer smaller. He said he agreed to treat the land like a thing that holds stories. He said he would do the same for me. We walked to the back door, and the cold came in with its clear instruction. He pointed out the generator housing and the tool shed and the path the mule follows because the mule is older than the fences. He spoke in the language of maintenance, which is the language of care. I listened and learned the new names for things I thought were just metal and wood. Back in the kitchen, he poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of me. I told him local council would file our first response today. I told him a deputy might come by to complete service of papers and that if anyone asked to enter for oversight, they would wait outside. He nodded once and said he would be visible but not loud. I liked that sentence. It belonged in this house. My phone vibrated on the counter with the insistent sound of a call that thinks it is more urgent than it is. The screen showed an unfamiliar number and the county seat label beneath it. I let it ring twice to make space for my own voice to take its place. Then I answered. The caller identified himself as a deputy from the sheriff's office. He said he was on the road and would arrive within the hour to deliver documents related to a civil matter. He said he was calling as a courtesy. His tone was professional and human. I thanked him and told him I would meet him at the door. The line went quiet, and the room returned to the present tense. Tom stood and said he would check the gate and make sure the keypad behaved. I watched him walk down the hall to the mudroom and disappear into the pale day. I stayed where I was and listened to the quiet places inside my chest. Law is a language. People assume we cannot learn it quickly. The truth is, we are bilingual by necessity. We speak at home, and we can speak in court if we must. I went to the library and opened the drawer again, and rested my hand on the portfolio with the red-marked map. The paper under my palm felt like a heartbeat. Out in the western acres, the ground held a story older than my grief, and maybe that was the point. Only when a woman knows the terms of her own ground does she become free. I closed the drawer gently and looked toward the window. Snow began to lift itself off the horizon, and the day brightened into a kind of resolve. He called it insurance. I called it love written in concrete. The hour after the call from the sheriff moved faster than the rest of the morning. Tom returned from the gate with the easy stride of a man who knows where ice lives. He looked at my face for a beat, and then away, the way decent people leave a person her dignity. He said there was something I needed to see before anyone with a badge came up the lane. He did not make it sound dramatic. He made it sound like maintenance. We crossed the yard with our breath, making small clouds that rose and faded. The barn to the west had kept its original coat of boards, weathered to a silver that looked like truth. Inside, it smelled of hay and old summers. Dust lifted and settled in the mild light that dropped through the gaps in the siding. Tools hung where hands would expect them. A saddle rested over a rail as if it had just cleared a back. Tom walked to the far corner where the floorboards darkened with age. He pushed aside 2 bales with the strength of a habit. Then he set his palm to a square of wood and looked at me once to ask for silence and consent. I nodded. He lifted the door I did not know was there. I let myself say the word trapdoor only once in my head and promised the earth I would not use it again. Stairs led down into a cool mouth of air. The smell changed to concrete and electricity and something like order. Tom took the first steps and found the switch at the landing. A single yellow bulb hummed to life and spilled a warm circle that made the shadows respectful. He said your husband called this room insurance. He waited a breath. Then he added, I call it proof that he loved you more than fear. The stairs ended in a corridor poured smooth and honest. My boots made a small sound that seemed to approve of careful intention. I felt my heart slow from the hurry of the yard to the pace a person uses when entering a church. The vault opened out into a square room lined with metal cabinets and shelves that had no sag in them. On the far wall, a large table held maps under glass. The same red arcs I had seen upstairs appeared again, now layered with notes in a hand that was not mine. The yellow bulb overhead made the red look less like a warning and more like truth with a pulse. A second lamp flicked on with a pull chain and widened the circle of seeing. Tom stayed near the stairs and let me walk first, because he understood what it means to be given a place. Folders sat arranged by year and subject, not the anxious stacks of a man drowning in paper. The calm taxonomy of someone who plans his steps before he takes them. A binder labeled titles sat beside another marked contracts, and a third with 2 words that made my skin rise. Rhodes Brothers. I did not open that one yet. My hand lingered over it the way you hover over something hot before you learn its heat. On a side shelf, a wooden frame held a photograph I had never seen. A boy with Richard's eyes stood beside a bright chestnut with a proud neck. The horse's ears were pricked toward the camera, and the boy's hand rested on the strong curve of the shoulder with the odd confidence of someone who has just been chosen. The back of the frame carried 3 words and a date in graphite. Ashfall, 17. Something in my chest lifted and then settled. That was the name he had never given me but had been carrying all this time. A history pressed into a single word and kept waiting like a seed in dry soil. I turned to Tom. He watched me absorb the room rather than lecture me about its uses. He said it plainly. He knew they would come back. He just did not know when. The sentence did not rush. It sat down and kept me company. I nodded and answered in the voice I trusted most. Then let us make sure they regret it. I opened the binder with the brother's name and found not a splash of anger, but a chronology that could teach patients how to wait. Photocopies of filings, account statements, letters from former employees whose signatures had been notarized with dates that matched seasons I could still picture, memos from a firm that specializes in following numbers where they prefer not to be seen. Notes in Richard's careful hand asking questions a prosecutor would ask. An index in the front pocket with entries cross-referenced to page and exhibit. He had not gathered gossip. He had collected evidence and sorted it in a way a court would understand. I took a second binder and found a series of declarations from a physician whose letterhead I recognized from home, dates spread across years we had already lived. Capacity was documented with a soft authority that did not need to raise its voice. Later tabs held clean copies of the purchase documents executed with that holding name and the transfers that placed every right in mine. Beneath those, another file contained a line of emails in which offers had been declined without seeking leverage. He had turned money away with the quiet conviction of someone who is saving something for a better purpose. On the map table, a drawer released with a small click and gave up a narrow case. Inside lay flash drives labeled with months, and a notebook of passwords written in a code I could read because I knew our codes. I thought of the empty chair upstairs, and the rows and the way the laptop had pulsed like a small heart. Here was the other half of that beat, the part that would speak to strangers in a language they respect. I placed my hand flat on the glass over the map and felt the room say 2 words, "Stand steady." Tom moved closer and pointed to a cabinet I had not yet opened. Inside were 3 large envelopes sealed and stamped with the names of agencies that do not smile. Each was addressed but not sent. On the face of each envelope, Richard had written a single instruction: deliver only if necessary. My throat tightened with the peculiar pain of being protected by someone who knew how hard protection can be to accept. I returned them to their shelf and closed the door with care. He showed me a smaller recess near the floor where a safe sat behind a plain panel. The combination was a number that only 2 people would connect to our lives. He looked away as I turned it. Inside, I found currency enough for emergencies, a small jewelry pouch that held a ring I had not worn in years, and a letter folded into thirds with my name on it in the hand that could still make my stomach feel young. I did not open the letter. Not yet. I placed it against my palm and then set it into the top of my coat where it could ride like a second heart. We stood without speaking for a minute that felt like shelter. The yellow light made the concrete warm, and the cabinets looked like a quiet army. The photograph of Ashfall caught the low glow and made the boy's face less guarded. I imagined Richard at that age learning where animals forgive and where they never do. I wondered what his brothers had been doing the day that picture was taken, and if any of them had noticed the luck that had welded itself to his hand. My mind offered me an old kindness. Not all cruelty is loud. Some of it is the shrug that looks away when someone is in need. He had built a room that could not look away. Tom cleared his throat as if to move air rather than to speak. He said, "You should know there is a small desk back here with a camera that records all comings and goings. Your husband set it to save locally and nowhere else." He did not bring it up to frighten me. He brought it up because this was a room that refused to let panic make the rules. He pointed to the unobtrusive lens set into a beam. I nodded. I had the odd sensation that a future judge would nod too if the need ever arose. I asked Tom how much of this he had known while Richard was alive. He took his time. He said he knew enough to do his job without jeopardizing mine. He said he had signed things that meant he would keep his mouth shut, even if a generous man with a hungry smile tried to open it. He said my husband had given him something a man like him does not receive often, a chance to be trusted again. He said he would not spoil that gift, now that the giver was gone. The bulb above us hummed, and the room felt like a held breath that refuses to turn into fear. I walked once around the perimeter, reading spines and labels, noticing the clean lines of metal against concrete. I touched the table, the safe, and the frame with the horse and the boy. Everything in it carried the same sentence written many ways: "You are not alone." We climbed the stairs and left the vault organized and patient. Back in the barn, the ordinary light felt almost frivolous. Dust drifted and settled. A bird had found a way in through a gap high above and debated the wisdom of staying. Tom lowered the door to the floor with quiet hands and pulled the bales back to where they had been. He did it without apology. He did it with the intimacy of someone restoring the stage so its next act would have the right props. We stepped into the yard, and the day lay itself fully against my face. Cold moved across my skin with that honest slap that wakes rather than punishes. The house looked the way it had before we went below it, and the porch continued to be a porch, but the sight of both had changed. Under everything, a structure now existed that would not be visible to men who mistake size for authority. The sheriff's cruiser turned into the lane while we watched, blue stripe catching a pale slice of sun, the engine noise small but official. I did not hurry. I let the light find my features. I let it write a new expression there. Tom glanced at me and then at the approaching car. He tilted his hat back a fraction and asked if I was ready to receive the day. I said I was. I said it in a voice that had been tempered by the light bulb in the room beneath our feet. We walked toward the porch together, with the barn behind us holding a secret that was not a lie, a secret that had been poured and cured and balanced so it could carry the weight I had not known I would need to place on it. As I reached the first step, the sun slipped out from a cloud and laid a clean bar of brightness across the railing. The light climbed my face like a hand finding a friend. I set my shoulders and lifted my chin. This was not a shout. This was a plan that had learned to breathe in silence. They told her I had stolen her future. I showed her who really had. Rain had been worrying the roof since morning, and the sky wore that soft, bruised color storms keep for themselves. The deputy had come and gone with calm manners and a clipboard. Tom had returned to his rounds with a nod that meant, "I see you." By afternoon, the light thinned, and my phone lit with a name that always made my breath go shallow. Grace was on her way. No emojis, no softened edges, just the sentence that becomes a knock. I set 2 cups on the kitchen table and let the kettle hum. I put a spoon beside each cup like a promise I hoped to keep. When she arrived, the door opened in a rush that let the rain speak for itself. She stood there in a coat that made her look younger and more certain than she was. Water clung to the ends of her hair. Her eyes took in the room as if it were a story that had not been told to her, and she was deciding whether to read it. She did not sit. She began with their names without giving them the dignity of family. "They called me last night. They said you have taken something that should be shared. They said Dad was not thinking clearly when he did this. They said the fair thing is to let them manage it until the court can make sense of it all." She paused just long enough to let me either break or breathe. I chose the second. I asked if she was hungry. She narrowed her eyes as if the question were a trick. I poured tea. The steam climbed and curled and then gave up. The cup sat between us and cooled without asking permission. Her voice had the stiffness of a stance held too long. "You should have told me. You should have told me about him, about this place, about what you plan to do." I told her I had planned to speak when my words could carry themselves across the table without needing a walker. She did not laugh. She folded her arms across her chest like a gate. "He lied to both of us. The sentence cracked the room. It found the old plaster in the corners that houses learn to hide and made it show. I let silence come and sit. Then I answered in the tone my mother used when I was the one who could not forgive. No, he trusted time to tell the truth. The rain raised its hand against the glass and lowered it again. She sat finally, but on the edge of the chair as if ready to run toward the door or through it. I slid the tea toward her and let it contact her fingers. Heat has a way of reminding us we have one body and one body only. She watched the surface of the cup like a scryer and then looked at me. Why would he build this and keep it stuffed in a pocket none of us could reach? Why would he put your name on everything and leave me to hear about it from men I do not even know? I said we could argue our grief all day and still find ourselves standing in the same rain. Or we could listen to the only person who had the right to explain his choices. She stared at me as if I had offered her a myth. I stood and walked to the library where the rose had dropped one soft petal onto the desk. I lifted the laptop and carried it back to the table the way I carried her when she was feverish and believed the world was spinning away from her bed. I set the machine down between the cups and opened it. The screen flared and calmed. I entered the one word that mattered, and a folder appeared that had not been visible before. It wore her name like a hand on a shoulder. Are you ready to hear him? The question made her chin lift in the way that lets you see the child and the woman at once. She nodded. I pressed play. Hello, my brilliant girl. Richard sat in the same chair where I had watched him talk to me. The light from the north window brushed his face and made years step aside. If you are watching this, then I did something difficult for reasons I can no longer explain in a room where you can interrupt me. He smiled in that sideways way she inherited. I wanted to give you a place to come back to when you do not know where you belong, a place that is ours without negotiation, a place with air that tastes like the first day you felt brave. He did not flinch from her anger. I should have told you. I did not. Because I was selfish enough to want a handful of ordinary days with your mother and with you that were not measured against a diagnosis. I wanted the two of you to live in the present long enough to learn its furniture. I wanted you to have a home that would still stand when the future came and took the chair I sit in now. He lifted a book from the table and tapped it with his knuckles. When you were 7, you asked me what forever means. I told you it means later, but not yet. This is my attempt at later. He looked off camera for a heartbeat and then back. I bought Ridgewood because it scared me. It scared me for all the old reasons and for some new ones. I chose to be afraid and generous at the same time. I put it in your mother's name because she knows how to ground a life better than I do. I built the studio because I saw what happened to her eyes when she held a brush. I did all of it because when you look for the safest place to fall, you should not have to ask permission. Grace's hands had gone still on either side of her cup. The tea had surrendered its heat. The smell of rain lifted in through the seam of the window and threaded itself through the room. I watched her watch him. I saw the quick defense in her eyes slow, and then lower its shield to see what stood there unarmed. He leaned back, and the chair complained in a way that made me ache. I need you to know that some men will arrive in your life offering shortcuts that look like help. I regret to tell you they may share my last name. He let that sit. You owe them politeness if you have the bandwidth. You owe them nothing else. If they tell you your mother is standing between you and the future, remember that your mother is the future I wanted for you. He paused. If they say I was not thinking clearly, I invite you to compare the room you are sitting in now with the rooms they build when no one is watching. His face changed then, a quieter light, not weakness. He said he kept a picture in his wallet for years. He held it up to the camera. The image shook a little the way hands do when they have been to too many places. It was not the boy in Ashfall. It was a photo of Grace, 6 years old, in a thrift store ballerina skirt, holding a stick like a baton and conducting a storm of leaves. He smiled at the memory in real time. This is why I learned to love the weather again, because you danced me back into it. He closed the notebook he had not read from. He rested his hands on the table as if blessing everything on it. When your mother is not here to catch you, let this place catch you. If she is here and you do not know how to ask her for help, let this place translate. He took a breath. I am asking you to avoid punishing her for what I did not tell you. I am asking you to bring your bright anger to me for the next few minutes and let it turn into something else. The video ended without flourish. No music, no fade. Just the square of his face turning to stillness, and then the screen waiting for our next command. We did not give one. We sat with the sound of the rain adjusting itself to a lighter frequency. In that small new quiet, I saw her shoulders drop the way they used to when I would smooth her hair at the end of a hard day in 3rd grade. She pressed her fingers to her eyes and left small crescents on her cheeks where they had been. When she spoke, her voice had moved down from the high branch where outrage perches. He made a choice that hurt and that helps. I said yes. Both can be true. She let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. You always say that when I want the world to be tidy. Both can be true. She lifted her cup and took a sip of what had become only a memory. She made a face and set it down. A raindrop pushed a long trail down the window and lost itself at the sill. She asked me if I knew about the messages for me. I said no. I said I discovered mine yesterday and had to sit very still until I remembered my own name. She looked at the laptop as if it were a person who had just said something both kind and audacious. I hate him a little, she said, and then she covered her face with both hands. I let her sit there. The body has to catch up to the heart. When she lowered her hands, she looked older in the way that means honest. She asked what the plan was with the men who had found their way into her phone. I told her the plan in its plainest clothes. We would let the court do its work. We would not feed their narrative by losing our voices. We would hold our ground without shouting. We would remember that sometimes the correct answer to a demand is no, and sometimes the correct answer is silence. We would choose. She nodded slowly like a person learning a new language by feeling the words in her mouth. She asked if she could see more of the ranch. Not the legal parts, the human ones. I told her yes, and I meant it with relief powerful enough to stand up by itself. We walked down the hall to the sunroom, where the glass made a frame for the weather. The rain slackened until it was more like breath than water. The pasture took off its coat and showed a green that had the nerve to live in winter. A faint band of color began to pull itself up from the horizon, as if someone under the earth were lifting a silk ribbon through the field. She stood with her arms folded loosely this time and said she could almost hear him clearing his throat in the next room. I said I could almost hear him telling us not to stand too close to the window because heat is a currency. She smiled despite herself. Then she went quiet and reached for my hand and did not hold it like a child or a woman in trouble. She held it like a person reaching for another person on level ground. We did not hug. We did not try to turn this into a television moment. We stood and watched the band of color widen into something even skeptics accept without arguing. The cup sat on the table behind us and cooled into symbols. The rain retired with dignity. I had thought reconciliation would arrive like a verdict. It arrived like the weather does. First, a change in light. Then, a new smell. Then the sense that you could open a window without losing anything important. She took a breath that inflated her whole ribcage and let it go. Tell me where the studio is. I led her to the doorway and let her step in first. She looked around, and her face rearranged itself into the expression she wore when she was small, and we entered a library for the first time. Her voice was soft enough to ask the room a question without startling it. He did this for you. I answered the truest way I could. He did it for us. The clouds pulled themselves apart just enough to allow a slim, clean light to find the far wall. It slid along the shelves and climbed the easel and settled on the waiting canvas like a quiet answer. We stood in that light with our fingers still linked. Somewhere behind us, tea cooled. Somewhere in front of us, a new thing was brave enough to begin. They came to divide the land. I came to divide truth from lies. Morning gave the ranch a clear light that made edges honest. Tom set the long table in the dining room with a carafe, 6 cups, and a pitcher of water. Ms. Reyes arrived with a slim briefcase and a posture that made permission unnecessary. Mr. Lowell called in on a laptop and waited with his sound muted, a calm square in the corner of the screen. I stood by the window and watched the lane while the coffee found its breath. When the black SUV curved into view, I felt nothing break inside me, only a readiness that felt like a level floor. They entered as a trio, coats tailored, shoes that did not understand mud. Alan carried a folder and a smile that wanted to sell me relief. Peter wore impatience like a watch. Carl scanned angles as if injustice might be hiding behind a chair. With them came a 4th man, silver hair, tan that belongs to people who travel for deals. He introduced himself without offering his hand. Mason Hale, Northridge Resources. His voice said, "We have already had this conversation in my head, and I won." I invited them to sit. No one touched the coffee. Silence did the work of introductions. Ms. Reyes spoke first and named the purpose simply. We will review claims that have been filed and the documents that hold this house up. We will address any request that involves supervision with clarity. She did not raise her voice. She placed it. Alan leaned back and made a triangle of his fingers. He began to speak of unity and respect and the need for order in times of transition. He used the same words men use when they plan to take something, while sounding like they are offering help. I let him finish. Then I said this meeting will be shorter if we choose nouns that match reality. He smiled again, thinner now. He said I had no idea what I was doing. I met his eyes. On the contrary, this is the first time I know exactly what I am doing. Tom stood at the sideboard with his arms easy at his sides. He was not on display. He was a fact. Ms. Reyes slid a single sheet to the middle of the table. This is our motion to dismiss your claim. It was filed this morning. Attached are affidavits from physicians who treated Mr. Hartman during the period in question and attest to his capacity. Attached also are records of the transaction that placed every right of this property into Mrs. Hartman's name. She tapped the paper once. The sound was not loud. It was complete. Hale cleared his throat and spoke of regional development and the need to move promptly on opportunities that benefit everyone. He glanced at me on the word everyone as if I might agree to be included. I poured coffee and did not drink it. The scent was an anchor. While he spoke, Peter slipped a paper across to me and asked for temporary access to the West Acreage for survey teams. He used the word courtesy. I used the word no. He tried to recover with a softer tone. There is a lot of money in the ground here. He let the number float without owning it. We can make this simple. We will manage the extraction. You can receive a generous share. The county will be grateful. I thought of the red marks on the map under glass in a room that he would never see. I thought of how easily numbers can unhouse a person. I set my cup down and folded my hands. You are asking me to surrender what is not yours. I will not do that. If you have business to conduct, do it with language that respects ownership. We are not sharing. We are negotiating when and whether to lease. That is a different verb. Alan reached for authority and came up with impatience. He said the petition would proceed. He said a judge would see their point. He said delays only complicate matters. He looked toward Hale as if the presence of a man with a tan could change the law. Ms. Reyes did not look at him. She looked at me. I nodded. She set a small remote in my palm. I pressed the button. A screen descended at the far end of the room with the quiet confidence of a well-made thing. An image bloomed. The map of Ridgewood spread itself open for strangers. Lines became a language. Red arcs like living veins crossed the western sections. The room changed temperature even if the thermostat did not move. Hale leaned forward and lifted his chin like a man trying to smell rain before it falls. This is the independent survey commissioned by my husband and verified by 2 additional firms. It was conducted 3 years ago. There are letters of intent from companies that have seen it. I have declined them. The red zones indicate the true depth and shape of what you plan to chase. You have been presuming on the eastern borders. You have been looking in the wrong direction. For the first time, Alan broke posture. The corners of his mouth fell away from each other. Peter blinked. Carl did not blink at all. Hale reached for a professional tone that had earned a lot of money. He asked what we were seeking. He tried to sound curious and failed. I did not answer him. I pressed the button again. A second slide appeared. Not numbers now. Documents, emails, declarations from former employees, financial trails that had learned how to hide until a quiet man taught them a better route. The binder named for the brothers had given me an order for this presentation that made me feel like a conductor who knows when to lift a hand. Ms. Reyes placed sealed envelopes in front of each brother. Her voice stayed even. Materials to be filed with the county prosecutor only if necessary. She did not look at the envelopes again. She had already done the moral work of placing them. Peter reached for bluster and found less of it than usual. This is a smear. He said it to the air, not to me. We are here to settle a family matter. Your attempt to weaponize old paperwork is beneath you. He looked at my face and found nothing to climb. I spoke the sentence Richard had taught me without ever saying it out loud. Secrets do not frighten me. They only complicate my filing system. Hale had turned his attention back to the map. He was thinking. I recognized the sound. He asked what it would take to begin a conversation. I said responsibility. He asked me to define it. I said you start by agreeing that the extraction will wait until environmental protections are satisfied by this household. You agree to a restoration trust that is funded before you begin. You accept monitoring by a third party that I approve. You agree that leases are not rights. They are temporary permissions with manners. He looked at Ms. Reyes as if to ask whether I was serious. She looked back as if to say, "You have met your match." He sat back and let silence assemble his reply. He said he would need to see the complete data set. I said he would not until the court closed the petition, and until his firm acknowledged in writing that previous communications from the brothers had misrepresented their standing. He asked whether I was open to discussion with competitors. I told him I had already invited one. The door from the hallway opened, and a woman with a winter coat folded over her arm entered with 2 associates. She introduced herself without ceremony. Claire Whitaker, High Plains Energy. Her voice had an edge I trusted. She nodded to Ms. Reyes, then to me, then to the screen. She had read the room before her coat had cooled. I had sent her the map days earlier with sections redacted. Enough to start a conversation, not enough to end one. She looked at Hale without malice and said that if Northridge was uncomfortable with accountability, High Plains was not. Alan stood as if movement could stop time. This is improper. This is highly irregular. He turned toward me as if a scolding might cause regret. The thing about irregular is that it is the right word for a course correction after years of the wrong course. I did not stand. I let the table make me tall. The coffee beside my hand had cooled to the perfect temperature. I lifted it and took a sip. It tasted like steadiness. Carl finally spoke. His voice was soft. He asked what we wanted from them. He did not mean percentages. He meant terms of peace. I told him. Withdrawal of the petition with prejudice. A signed acknowledgement that they possess no authority to speak for the property. A commitment in writing to cease contact with Grace about legal matters. A promise to stay off this land without explicit permission. His eyes flicked to the envelopes in front of them. He looked ill. For a moment, I saw the boy he might have been if his life had been built in a room with more windows. Hale shifted again. He asked Claire for privacy. She smiled with an almost kind courtesy. Privacy would have served you better if you had told the truth. She opened her leather notebook and began listing terms that mirrored mine, and added numbers that would make a county commissioner sit up straight. Restoration fund, monitoring. A pause long enough to let spring teach me the shape of the land before any rig arrived to argue with it. Alan tried one more version of control. He said a judge might not look kindly on ambushes. Ms. Reyes folded her hands. A judge will look kindly on a woman defending a clear title with clarity. The ambush happened years ago when your family hid theft inside the word tradition. Her voice did not lift. It did not have to. I pressed the button one last time. The map faded, and the screen showed a single document. It was a signed deed. The signature at the bottom looked like a man who had stopped pretending he would live forever. My name under it looked like a promise kept. We sat in that image. No one spoke. Perhaps that was the most persuasive statement of the day. Alan gathered his papers and avoided his envelope. Peter stared at Hale as if a different executive would materialize if he looked hard enough. Carl placed his hands on the table and spread his fingers as if learning again how to count. Hale thanked me for my time with the politeness of a man who has already begun to rewrite his plan. Claire closed her notebook and told Ms. Reyes she would expect a draft of the accountability framework by evening. She looked at me and asked if I needed anything before she left. I said only a quiet minute. She gave it to me by taking her people out into the hall. The brothers did what men do when the narrative has changed. They tried to salvage dignity and found that dignity had not been for sale. Alan tried for one last sentence. You have no idea what you are doing. I answered without heat. On the contrary, this is the first time I know exactly what I am doing. They stood. Chairs made a small chorus of protest. The door opened, and the corridor received them without ceremony. Their shoes clicked in a rhythm that belongs to retreat. Tom followed to show them out as a courtesy, not as an apology. Claire and Hale departed in different directions. Ms. Reyes remained at the table and breathed in a way only people who know courtrooms breathe. Mr. Lowell unmuted and said a single word that felt like a well-placed brick. Solid. The house returned to its size. The map on the screen held steady and then went dark. I sat with both hands around my cup. The room listened. The storm I had expected had not arrived. It turned out justice did not need thunder. It needed a table, a screen, paper that told the truth, and a voice willing to say no without cruelty. In the hallway, the front door opened. Winter stepped in, and then out. The SUV rolled away down the lane, and the sound diminished until it belonged to the pines. I walked to the window and watched the gravel settle. The coffee had gone lukewarm, the way life does after heat has done its job. I drank the rest anyway. The aftertaste was calm. I switched off the projector and stood for a moment in the softened light. Tom returned and leaned in the doorway with a question on his face. I shook my head to say no injuries to report. Ms. Reyes gathered her papers and slipped them into her case. She told me the next steps and the next documents, and the way the clerk would process the dismissal. She touched my forearm once and left. Silence arrived like a good teacher. It gave me a long minute to understand that something had crossed from danger into form. Justice did not need a blade. It needed the right truth at the right time. I stood in that new quiet and let it take root. Then I carried the empty cups to the kitchen sink and held them under warm water. The rising steam looked like breath returning to a body that had finally decided to live. At sunrise, the coffee did not taste like revenge. It tasted like peace. I wrapped both hands around the mug and stood at the north window while the first pale color lifted itself over the pasture. The glass was cool under my palm. The field held its breath and then let it go. A thin ribbon of light found the fence line and turned it from a boundary into a sentence that continued. The house made its small morning sounds, wood adjusting, heat rising, a polite creak that felt like a greeting. I took a sip and tasted something simple and clean, the kind of flavor that arrives when there is nothing left to fight in the room. Tom came by early to look at the sky the way men look at a calendar. He pointed toward the ridge and nodded as if a promise had been kept. He said the air would be kind by noon, and the lower pasture would carry a person without asking for their dignity. He did not stay long. He had chores to keep the world in place. He left me with a wave and a sentence that made me smile after the door had closed. A day like this knows how to do its job. Grace slept late in the guest room. The storm in her had done its work and spent itself, and now rest was the correct medicine. I let the household hold her. I refilled my cup and walked the hallway, my fingertips brushing the edge of frames as if reading Braille. Photographs of land that had once been a stranger now recognized me on sight. In the library, the rose had managed to stay beautiful longer than anyone could fairly expect. I changed its water and watched the petal edges darken in a way that was dignified, not tragic. The laptop waited without urgency. I knew what it held. The folder with my name, the folder with hers. The messages we had already received were like letters carried across a river. One remained that I had not opened because endings are better as doorways than as walls. I put the cup down, drew a breath from deeper than habit, and pressed the key that wakes a quiet machine. His face filled the screen with that unsentimental kindness he wore at the end of a long day. He did not introduce himself. He did not apologize. He looked past the camera at the window and smiled at whatever weather the past had provided. Then he turned back to me. If you have made it this far, you have already done the hardest part. He paused as if listening for a sound only he could hear. When you paint again, I will know you have forgiven life. It did not land like instruction. It landed like a door left open. He did not tell me what to make or how to begin, or which colors belong to freedom. He only connected the act to a truth I had been circling since the first night here. To forgive life is not to approve of its choices. It is to stop arguing with the river about where it came from and walk into it as yourself. The screen dimmed slightly as if a cloud had passed in front of his face. He lifted a hand halfway and let it fall. Until tomorrow, he said. And for the first time that message felt less like a promise and more like a blessing given to the part of me that would need it when the videos ended and the next hour asked for my answer. I closed the laptop gently and carried that sentence down the hall like you carry a bowl that is full. The studio accepted me without a sound. Northlight laid its hand along the long wall and climbed the canvas with quiet authority. Brushes waited in their jars as if they had always known they would meet this morning. The smell of new linen and old wood met the last trace of coffee in my mouth. I stood before the empty field of white and let the part of me that used to begin without permission return to her work. The first mark was not brave. It was honest. A thin line to locate horizon, a soft curve to invite movement, a wash of gray where snow becomes air and air becomes intention. I felt the familiar tug in my shoulder and the welcome ache along the ribs where breath deepens to meet attention. I let the underpainting set while I walked to the window. Outside, two dark shapes moved along the fence like notes on a staff. Tom had turned out the pair I had come to recognize by gait alone. The older mare with the wise eye. The younger gelding with a question in his step. They trotted, then slowed, then broke into a canter that stitched the field with joy. For a brief stretch, they ran straight into the light and became more light than horse. I returned to the canvas with their movements still in my chest. I pulled the dark through the center where muscle remembers what wind taught it. I lifted brightness along the crest and let shadow learn manners along the flank. I was not painting a likeness. I was granted permission to paint. Two figures emerging from a field that refuses to be only winter. Space opening in front of them as if it had been waiting for the right company. In the foreground, a hint of grass that had the nerve to survive. In the background, a ridge that knew how to watch without telling anyone what to do. Grace came in softly and leaned against the doorframe, as if approaching a bird. I did not turn right away. I wanted the brush to finish its sentence. When I did look at her, I saw what I had hoped to see. The old sunlight of childhood moving across her face, the new steadiness of a woman who has chosen where to place her feet. She looked from me to the canvas and back again. Her voice was gentle and alive. "What will you paint next, Mom?" I wiped the bristles clean and set the brush down with care. "Whatever comes after peace." She smiled and understood that answer in its full size. She came to my side, not behind me, and stood facing the same light. We watched the wet surface catch it and shine. We stood like that for a while, two people resting inside a room a man had built because he believed in love as a structure. When the moment turned from shining to simply good, she touched my sleeve and said she would make something in the kitchen. I told her I would join her when the horses moved from running to grazing. We both laughed because it was such a specific rule and yet exactly right. After she left, I added a small sign that only a few would notice. On the far edge of the field, near the suggestion of a fence, a third figure, smaller, is moving from shadow into the open. Not a ghost, not a promise, a daughter on a path of her own. The three of us did not touch. We did not need to. The eye made the connection, the heart finished the line. I cleaned the brushes, let the water run clear, then turned and sat with my back against the windowsill. The studio held me the way a good porch does, without agenda. Outside, the pair had relaxed into that lazy dance horses do when they are pleased to do nothing. Their breath puffed in small content clouds. A crow argued with a fence post and won. The day had become exactly itself. I walked out to the porch with my empty cup and felt the air brush my face, as if to say that winter can be a friend when you know where to stand. The boards were sun-warmed in patches, and I moved my feet into those squares like a child playing a game. In the far field, a fox made a brief red punctuation and then was gone. I thought about the word stay, how hard it is to do, how different it feels when the place you choose does not trap you but meets you. Grace called from the kitchen and asked how many eggs were enough for 2 appetites and an idea. I told her to be generous. I told her I would bring in the herbs that had survived the frost, just to be contrary. I stepped down into the yard and walked toward the small garden. Snow had receded enough to reveal stubborn green. I clipped what I could with a sense of gratitude that had nothing to do with recipes. On the way back, I paused by the barn. I put my hand on the door and felt the memory that lives in wood respond to me. Beneath the floor, something steady and quiet waited without demanding to be named. It was not a secret anymore. It was a foundation. I thanked it in the way people thank things that do not require thanks. Then I turned toward the house and climbed the steps with both hands full of scent. Inside, pans met heat, and butter took the first risk. We moved around each other without choreography and did not bump into anything important. Breakfast became a ceremony not because it was fancy, but because we were. We ate at the sunroom table and watched the field. We talked about small things and let the small things become large enough. When we fell quiet, it was not because we had nothing to say. It was because silence had joined the conversation and we wanted to hear its part. Later, after the dishes, I went back to the studio to sign the lower corner in a hand I had not used in years. I chose a date and then paused and added a single word that would be our own private calendar. Morning. The paint would take time to settle and become itself. So would I. I carried a chair to the north window and sat where the light touched my shoulder. For a while, I did nothing that could be measured. I watched. I remembered. I forgave, not with speeches, with breath, with the decision to let the past be a landscape instead of furniture. Richard's last message had not asked me to be brave. It had asked me to be honest about what I wanted to live inside. Now I knew. I wanted to live inside this light. Inside a room where 2 horses run in snow and never seem to tire. Inside a house that learned to tell the truth in wood and glass. Inside a life where justice was the beginning, not the end. Grace came to the door again, leaned her head in, and asked if I needed anything from town later. I said maybe more coffee, the good kind. She rolled her eyes in a way that made us both laugh and promised to get it. We did not make a plan bigger than noon. It felt like enough. The day warmed as promised. The sound of a truck far off on the road rose and fell like a tide that would never reach us. A thin cloud drifted across the sun and changed nothing essential. I stood and took one last look at the canvas. The figures were still wet and alive. They would dry into something that could be touched without leaving a mark. I turned off the light, which no longer mattered, because the north window had learned my name and would keep saying it. I walked back into the hall. The house breathed with me. The front door stood open to winter that had decided to be gentle. I stepped into the entry and picked up my mug and carried it toward the porch. As I reached the threshold, I paused and looked back, not with doubt but with respect. This is how you leave a room that has returned you to yourself, with gratitude worthy of the light it keeps. Then I stepped outside. The camera of my mind pulled back on its quiet track. The golden hour arrived early and spilled through the frame. It flooded the doorway, crossed the floor, climbed the wall, and found the canvas waiting. In that soft brightness, I understood that the table of reckoning had only been a doorway. What mattered now was the life that came after the door. Peace held out its hand. I took it and walked forward. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.